Welcome to another episode of Eric Waite Whiskey Studies, and this is the beginning of a new series on the business of Scotch whiskey. Previously, I did a video series on the history of Scotch whiskey, and these videos are intended to be a means of studying, particularly for the diploma in single malt Scotch from the Edinburgh Whisky Academy. However, you may also enjoy this series if you just want to know more about Scotch whiskey. And I think having an understanding of why things are in the Scotch whiskey industry is really important. It gives you an understanding of the trajectory of where Scotch is going if you're a consumer, why things are changing, why whiskeys can and cannot be sold in particular ways, why things are labeled in particular ways. So having an understanding of the history of Scotch whiskey, just as a consumer, I think will be really, really helpful. A lot of the complaints that I hear and read about changes in the Scotch whiskey industry are often based on the ignorance of just how the history of Scotch whiskey has developed in the business of Scotch whiskey. A lot more people, I think, would have a better understanding of fewer complaints, or sometimes even more complaints, if they understood the history and business of Scotch whiskey. By the way, I have already taken and passed the diploma in single malt Scotch whiskey from the Edinburgh Whisky Academy, and I want to tell you, it's not a super easy course. It's not a class where you're just going to show up, you just kind of wing it and pass. You need to be studying particularly the business of Scotch whiskey and the history of Scotch whiskey before you attend the class. The class is 2 days long, and the pre-course reading is not covered in the class, and yet it's a major part of the exam. The exam has 6 components to it, and you have to pass each component in order to pass the exam. Now, I'm going to go more in depth on the Edinburgh Whisky Academy diploma in single malt Scotch during my series of videos in which I share my recent trip to Scotland in July 2019. And that'll be coming up just after this series. So in the meantime, I'm going to be enjoying a dram of the Balblair 12-year-old. This is a new release, although most of this whiskey is gone. I got this bottle from Phil and Deepa over at Captain 3D, and I've already did a review of this whiskey, so if you want to know more about it and the new branding and so forth of Balblair, you want to check that video out. Alrighty, let's get into it. In 1908, a royal commission was established to decide what restrictions should apply to the production of Scotch whiskey, and in 1909 issued its report. Following this, in 1915, the Immature Spirits Restriction Act came into law, which required Scotch whiskey to mature in barrels for a minimum of 2 years. This was extended to 3 years in 1916. Now, if you watched my series on the history of Scotch whiskey, you may say, wait a minute, didn't we already cover this in the history class? Yes, we did. There's going to be overlap between history and the business of Scotch whiskey, and I'll get into another series in 2020 on the production of Scotch whiskey, and some of these issues will be repeated in that series as well. All topics related to whiskey are related to all the other topics in whiskey, so there's going to be a little bit of overlap. Scotch whiskey has been defined legally since 1933 in the United Kingdom and in the European Community law since 1989. Scotch whiskey is protected by European law, namely EC Regulation 110/2008 as a geographical indication, or GI. This sets out rules and regulations on the definition, description, and labeling of a wide range of spirits, including whiskey. The most recent UK legislation, specifically related to Scotch whiskey, is the Scotch Whisky Regulations of 2009. These regulations govern the production, labeling, and presentation of Scotch whiskey. So there was a lot of controversy about the rebranding, relabeling, and repricing of Balblair and going from vintage to age statements, but this is going across the Scotch whiskey industry. There are a lot of distilleries that are rebranding, repositioning themselves and it's causing quite a ruffle among the Scotch whiskey community. So understanding the history of Scotch whiskey and the business of Scotch whiskey, I think will add some insight into why Bow Blair changed. So keep on watching. Prior to 1989, Scotch whiskey was protected by the laws of a number of individual EU countries. For example, Scotch whiskey has been protected by an appellation of origin in France since 1975 as part of a bilateral agreement between France and the United Kingdom. Outside of the European Union, many countries have defined Scotch whiskey in their own legislation as whiskey that is produced solely in Scotland. For example, the United States legislation relating to Scotch whiskey defines it as whiskey which is a distinctive product of Scotland, manufactured in Scotland in compliance with the laws of the United Kingdom relating the manufacture of Scotch whiskey for consumption in the United Kingdom. Scotch whiskey is also registered as a geographical indication in a number of countries, including Canada, China, India, Malaysia, Panama, Thailand, Turkey, Vietnam, Macau, Peru, and the Dominican Republic, and many others. In countries where there is no specific legal definition of Scotch whiskey, it is still protected under the national laws to prevent false claims or fraudulent marketing. So, sort of explain that. Oftentimes, we call a product by a brand name even if it isn't that brand name. For example, someone may ask, hey, do you have a Kleenex? And what they really mean is, do you have a tissue? They're not necessarily referring to the brand Kleenex. They just want a tissue to blow their nose. But we get so accustomed to equating the brand Kleenex to tissues that we call all tissues a Kleenex. Same thing happens with, say, making photocopies, right? People say, oh, they have a document, they have a piece of paper or something, and they say, oh, I want to Xerox this document. What they mean is they want a photocopy of the document. But again, we've gotten so accustomed to equating photocopying with the brand Xerox, we tend to say Xerox even if the machine itself is not made by Xerox. Well, the same thing has happened in the wine and whiskey world. Champagne, for example, and you can still find some here in the United States. Champagne is a geographical indicated area in France. You can only call a sparkling wine champagne if it is from Champagne. But what happened is, here in the United States, sparkling wine was being produced. They tended to think of sparkling wine the same way, like I just said, with Xerox or Kleenex, and they wanted people to think of a high quality sparkling wine. And so sparkling wines made here in California were being labeled as champagne from California. Now, they weren't trying to make people think it was actually from Champagne, France. They were just using the word champagne in the place of the word sparkling wine. Well, eventually, laws got set in place to where you cannot call a sparkling wine champagne unless it is from Champagne. And if you do, for example, here in California, there are some older producers here in California that still call some sparkling wine champagne. But if you do, you cannot export that bottle into the European Union, all right? So most of the sparkling wine producers here in California, they used to call it champagne, have switched and now call it sparkling wine. Well, the same thing can happen for Scotch. And I've seen this. People will say that they want a Scotch. What they mean is they want a whiskey. Now, they may be referring specifically to Scotch, but they say, hey, I want a Scotch. Or I've actually seen this in television as well. They'll refer to something as a Scotch when what they really mean is just a whiskey, regardless of where it particularly came from. So, in fact, and this is, it's like nails on a chalkboard. I've actually heard someone refer to it as an American whiskey as a Scotch. But I think the thought behind it isn't that they're trying to confuse something from Scotland versus something from with the United States. It's just they tend to equate quality. They tend to equate a whiskey so much with Scotland that they start calling all whiskeys Scotch. Well, these regulations, as part of the Scotch business industry, is to protect the name of Scotch. So not just people who want to, say, fraudulently try to fool consumers thinking that their product is from Scotland, but also just to keep those from using the word Scotch in a more general fashion to refer to whiskey. In principle, the laws relating to Scotch whiskey are relatively straightforward. In very simple terms, Scotch whiskey by law can only be made from 3 ingredients, namely water, malted barley, and yeast. If you're thinking, well, wait a minute, what about peat? Peat is a fuel source. Yes, it adds flavor, but it's not considered an ingredient. Likewise, the barrels add a lot of flavor to Scotch whiskey, but it's not considered an ingredient. It's the maturation vessel for Scotch whiskey, which then adds flavor, but it's not considered an ingredient. So, again, Scotch whiskey can only be made from 3 ingredients, namely water, malted barley, and yeast. They must be made into a mash and distilled. The spirit produced must be only matured in Scotland, in an excise warehouse, in oak cask no larger than 700 liters. Now, that's kind of funny, 700 liters, because if you look at cask in a warehouse in Scotland, it's either a bourbon, which would be 200 liters. It could be a hogshead, which is 250 liters, or a sherry cask. And sherry casks are huge, and those are 500 liters. So I've never ever seen 700 liters. Don't know why anybody would want to use a 700 liter cask, because you really wouldn't have that much interaction between the oak and the spirit, so it wouldn't be contributing that much. But they had to set a limit somewhere. They set it at 700 liters. The spirit must be matured for no less than 3 years and bottled at no less than 40% alcohol by volume. And let's take a little sip. Only a delicious whiskey. A little bit of sweetness there. Got some tropical notes of vanilla. Actually some vanilla pudding. A little bit of banana. Definitely some pear. Perhaps a little bit of peach. And it's actually real creamy. It's got a nice long finish. And also has some baking spices, particularly on the back end. A little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of nutmeg, and really, really nice. But for a full review, check out my video. The Scotch Whisky Regulations 2009 defines Scotch whisky as A, that has been distilled in Scotland from water and malted barley. To whiskey, only whole grains or other cereals may be added, all of which have been processed at the distillery into a mash, converted at the distillery into fermentable substrate only by indigenous enzymes. When they talk about substrate, they talk about converting starch into sugar. Fermented at the distillery only by the addition of yeast that has been distilled at an alcohol strength by volume of less than 94.8%, so that the distillate has an aroma and taste derived from the raw materials used in and the method of its production. Now you say, why do they specify that? Because whiskey, even though perhaps maybe not as much as wine, has a sense of place. And the idea is to maintain the integrity of the reputation of Scotch whiskey, so that it has a sense of provenance, a sense of place. And so they want Scotch whiskey to seem, to taste like it's from Scotland and not somewhere else. So they, other than the use of oak, they don't want you radically changing the very nature, character of Scotch whiskey so that it loses its connection to Scotland. That has been matured only in oak casks of a capacity of not exceeding 700 liters. That has been matured only in Scotland. That has been matured for a period of no less than 3 years. That has been matured only in an excise warehouse or permitted place. That retains the color, aroma, taste, derived from the raw materials used in and the method of its production and maturation, to which no substance other than water and spirit caramel has been added, and that has a minimum alcohol bottling strength of 40% alcohol by volume. Only Scotch whisky can be made in Scotland. The Scotch Whisky Regulations 2009 stipulate that the only type of whisky that can be produced in Scotland is Scotch whisky. The reason for this regulation is in order to prevent two grades of whisky being produced in Scotland, one being Scotch whisky, according to the legal definition, and the other being some other form of whisky produced in Scotland. If there were two grades of whisky, it would be very difficult to protect Scotch whisky as a unique and distinctive product in the UK and globally. So, in fact, there are currently some lawsuits against some foreign countries that are producing a spirit, and they'll put something equivalent to made in the style of Scotch whisky or something like that. Though they won't call it Scotch, but they'll sort of want to have some equation with Scotch, and that is not legal as well. It is illegal to label, package, sell, or advertise any drink as Scotch whisky or Scotch, or in such a way as to suggest indirectly that the drink is Scotch whisky when it does not qualify as such and meet all the criteria of the law. Bulk export of Scotch whisky. While it is illegal to mature Scotch whisky outside of Scotland, it is also illegal to export any type of Scotch whisky in oak casks or other wooden casks because it would continue to mature. It is permitted to export the following categories of Scotch whisky in inert containers, such as plastic drums or steel containers: single grain Scotch whisky, blended malt Scotch whisky, blended grain Scotch whisky, blended Scotch whisky, or other categories. It can be bottled for sale elsewhere. In other words, so you can ship a whiskey in an inert container and then bottle it somewhere else. And usually that's done for blending. Say in Japan, well, they'll buy Scotch whisky and blend it with Japanese whiskey, particularly now that they have a shortage. Single malt Scotch may only be moved to another country in an inert bottle and labeled for retail sale. In other words, it has to be bottled in Scotland, right? So are these other categories of Scotch whisky, which we're going to get into in our next video. Grain whiskey, blended malt whiskey, blended grain whiskey can all be shipped in inert containers. Single malt Scotch can only be bottled in Scotland. They can only be shipped in an inert bottle. So the idea is they don't want that thing leaving Scotland and then someone else adding something else to it. So if you know of a business that say that they bought a cask from Scotland and they are selling a special store exclusive bottling, and they have the cask, and what you're getting from the bottle is coming straight from the cask that they had shipped over to the United States. There's several things. Either they're lying because they're ignorant of the laws, they don't know that's not legal, or two, you know what? The reality is, if you want an elephant in your backyard, you could probably go somewhere and find someone who can somehow manage to get you an elephant if you've got the money, right? Well, the same thing. If you know someone, if you've got the money, you could probably export a cask of single malt Scotch whiskey and get it into the United States. You know, there's all kinds of legal things going on in the world, but it is illegal. If you wanted to then turn around and attempt to sell it, you could probably look at spending a lot of money on lawyers. You're going to spend a lot of time in court, and you're going to absolutely ruin your business or your name. Now, I could see people doing that and then not selling it, so that's not open to the public. This is just their consumption and for the consumption of their friends. But if they're planning on selling it, they should make it known that they somehow, illegally had a cask shipped out of Scotland and they're bottling it in the United States or anywhere else other than Scotland, and they should become known. They could probably look at spending a ton of money on lawyers. So I I don't recommend that anyone attempting to do that. All right, so that's it for this first lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to keep this series, each episode, fairly short. There's a lot of material to cover, and I want to give it to you in sort of short, bite-sized pieces. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, leave them down below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed already, please do, and share this with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and other social networking channels. Until next time, cheers.